Welcome to Her True Stories, the home of tales of shocking revenge. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Ring that notification bell because every Tuesday, we share stories of women who refuse to stay victims. Stories of revenge, redemption, and the kind of justice that courts can't deliver. Today's story will make you question everything you think you know about the people closest to you. So grab your coffee, settle in, and prepare to witness what happens when a woman finally opens her eyes. My name is Ruth Gerard, and for 10 years I lived in complete darkness. But let me tell you something. When God finally gave me back my sight, the first thing I saw was my husband planning my murder. If you think you know betrayal, if you think you've seen the worst that love can become, then listen closely. Because what I'm about to tell you about trust, deception, and the sweet taste of perfectly planned revenge will change how you see every relationship in your life. This isn't just about losing my vision and getting it back. This is about discovering that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who see us least clearly, even when our eyes work perfectly. October 15th, 2013. The date is burned into my memory like a brand, marking the moment my life split into two distinct parts, before and after. We'd been at the Wainwright wedding. You know the type. One of those obscenely expensive affairs where the bride's dress costs more than most people's cars and the flowers could fund a small charity. I was 59 then, still turning heads despite my age, wearing an emerald silk dress that Philip had actually complimented earlier that evening. "You look stunning tonight, Ruth," he'd said, adjusting his bow tie in our bedroom mirror. "That dress brings out your eyes." I should have known something was wrong. Philip hadn't complimented my appearance in years. The reception was at Millbrook Country Club, where we'd been members for over a decade. Old money, older traditions, and enough alcohol flowing to drown a small town. Philip had started drinking during the cocktail hour and hadn't stopped. By the time we were ready to leave at midnight, he could barely walk a straight line. "Philip, give me the keys," I said as we stood in the parking lot, autumn wind whipping through my carefully styled auburn hair. "You're in no condition to drive." His blue eyes, the same eyes that used to look at me with love, flashed with that familiar anger I'd been seeing more and more lately. "I'm fine, Ruth. Stop treating me like an invalid." "You're not fine. You can barely stand up." He snatched the keys from my outstretched hand with unnecessary force. "Get in the car, or find your own way home. I'm not having this argument in front of half the country club." I looked around the parking lot. A few other couples were making their way to their cars, most of them having had the good sense to arrange designated drivers or call taxis. The Hendersons waved goodbye as their driver held open the door of their town car. I could have walked over to them, could have asked for a ride, could have called my sister Caroline or taken a taxi, or done literally anything other than climb into that passenger seat. But 27 years of marriage had trained me to choose peace over principle, to avoid public scenes, to trust that somehow everything would work out fine. I got in the car. The first few miles were tolerable. Philip drove with exaggerated care, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles went white. We made it through downtown without incident, past the shopping district where I'd built my successful real estate business, onto the winding road that led home through Millbrook Forest. That's when Philip's liquid confidence kicked in. "You know what your problem is, Ruth?" he said, accelerating past the speed limit as we entered the first curve. "You never trust me. 27 years of marriage and you still think I can't handle myself." "I trust you when you're sober," I replied, watching the speedometer climb past 50, then 60. "Right now you're drunk." "I am not drunk." The words came out slurred, proving my point. "I had a few drinks at a wedding. That's what normal people do. Normal people don't drive afterward." "There you go again." Philip's voice rose as he took another curve too fast, tires squealing against asphalt. "Always criticizing, always assuming the worst. Just like your mother." The comparison hit like a slap. My mother had died 5 years earlier, a woman who'd spent her life worrying about disasters that rarely materialized. Philip knew how much I hated being compared to her, knew exactly which buttons to push to hurt me most effectively. I'm not being critical. I'm trying to keep us alive. You should have trusted me. Philip turned to glare at me instead of watching the road, his face twisted with years of accumulated resentment. You never trust me anymore. You question everything I do, second-guess every decision. When did you become such a... The tree came out of nowhere. One moment Philip was shouting at me. The next moment the world exploded into chaos. Breaking glass, screaming metal, the sensation of flying through space as our BMW hit the massive oak at 65 miles per hour. I remember seeing Philip's face in that split second before impact, not frightened or remorseful, but furious that I dared to question his judgment. Then darkness swallowed everything. I woke up 6 days later in Mercy General Hospital, my head wrapped in bandages that felt like a turban made of gauze and regret. Every part of my body ached, but the pain was distant, muffled by whatever medication they were giving me. The first thing I tried to do was open my eyes. Nothing happened. I blinked repeatedly, certain there was something covering my face, some medical device blocking my vision. But my fingers found only bandages around my head, nothing over my eyes themselves. Philip. My voice came out as a croak, barely audible. Ruth. Thank God you're awake. His hand closed over mine, warm and familiar, but there was something different in his voice. Relief, yes, but underneath it something else. Something that made my stomach clench with unidentifiable dread. I can't see, I whispered, the words feeling impossible and foreign. I know, sweetheart. The doctors explained everything. There was trauma to your optic nerves, swelling around the pathways between your eyes and brain. They're hopeful it might improve as the inflammation goes down. Might improve. The qualifier hung in the air like a death sentence. What about you? I asked, my hand searching for his face, needing to touch something real and solid. Are you hurt? A pause that lasted just a beat too long. Bruises. Mild concussion. The airbag and seatbelt did their job. Of course they had. Philip had always been lucky, especially when his luck came at someone else's expense. Dr. Maria Martinez explained my condition in the gentle but clinical tone doctor's perfect for delivering life-altering news. Traumatic optic neuropathy. Damage to the neural pathways that carried visual information from my eyes to my brain. The inflammation might subside, allowing partial or even complete recovery of my sight. Or it might not. We'll monitor your progress closely over the next several months, Dr. Martinez said, her accent adding a musical quality to words that felt like hammering nails into a coffin. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this could be permanent. Permanent. The word echoed through my drug-hazed consciousness as Philip squeezed my hand and murmured reassurances that sounded increasingly hollow with each repetition. For the first week, Philip barely left my bedside. He brought flowers whose fragrance I could smell but never see, lilies and roses that filled my room with perfume and pity. He read to me from magazines and newspapers in a voice that grew more strained each day, as if the effort of performing devotion was physically exhausting him. Visitors came and went like characters in a play I could hear, but not see. My sister, Caroline, flew in from Phoenix, her familiar voice thick with tears as she held my hand and promised everything would be fine. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and sympathy. Friends from the country club sent cards and fruit baskets and whispered conversations about how tragic it all was. But even through the fog of pain medication and shock, I began to notice things about Philip. The way his voice changed when he thought I was sleeping, less careful, more irritated. The phone conversations he took in the hallway, always ending abruptly when I asked who had called. Just work, he'd say. Nothing important. And underneath his concerned husband performance, I detected something that made my new vulnerability feel even more terrifying. Resentment. It started as subtle sighs when I asked him to repeat something. A slight delay before he answered my questions. The way he'd shift in his chair when I needed help with basic tasks that had once been effortless. But late at night, when he thought the medication had pulled me into unconsciousness, I heard him talking to himself in whispers that cut through the darkness like knives. "You should have trusted me," he muttered one night, his voice barely audible but dripping with accusation. "You should have trusted me to get us home safely." This is what happens when you question everything, when you can't just let me handle things. I lay perfectly still, hardly breathing, as the full weight of his words settled over me like a burial shroud. He was blaming me for the accident, for my blindness, for the disruption to his carefully ordered life. In that moment, lying helpless in my hospital bed surrounded by machines monitoring my broken body, I realized that losing my sight might not be the worst thing that had happened to me that night. The worst thing was finally seeing my husband clearly for the first time in 27 years. Coming home from the hospital was like entering an alien world designed by a cruel architect. Every familiar space had been transformed into an obstacle course of potential disasters. The house that had been my sanctuary for over 2 decades suddenly felt like a maze where every step could lead to injury, every room held invisible dangers, and every piece of furniture had become a silent enemy waiting to bruise my shins or trip me up. Philip had made modifications while I was recovering, handrails in the bathroom like prison bars, non-slip mats that felt like warnings under my feet, a chairlift for the stairs that announced my disability with every mechanical whir. To anyone watching, he appeared to be the devoted husband, anticipating my needs and ensuring my safety. But I felt the reluctance in every gesture, heard the barely controlled irritation in every instruction. "The coffee maker is to the left of the sink now," he'd announce with the patience of a kindergarten teacher addressing a slow child. "I moved it so you wouldn't have to reach over the stove. Try to remember that." "Thank you," I'd whisper, because what else could I say? I was completely dependent on his goodwill now, trapped in a body that could no longer navigate the world independently. The first month, Philip did everything with the martyrdom of a saint bearing crosses. He cooked our meals, simple things like sandwiches and microwaved frozen dinners, nothing like the elaborate Sunday roasts and dinner parties I used to host. He managed our finances, ran errands, handled every detail of our daily existence. To the outside world, he was the picture of sacrifice and devotion. But slowly, incrementally, like water wearing away stone, things began to change. It started with small cruelties disguised as helpful corrections. The way he'd sigh when I asked him to read the mail, as if my request was an unreasonable burden. The impatience that crept into his voice when I couldn't find something he'd moved without telling me. The casual way he'd rearrange items in our kitchen, then act annoyed when I fumbled around searching for things that were no longer where they'd been for years. "I told you I moved the sugar," he'd say when I spent 5 minutes searching the cabinets, my hands shaking with frustration and embarrassment. "It's next to the stove now. Try to pay attention when I'm explaining things." But he hadn't told me. I would have remembered. In my new world of darkness, every piece of information was precious, cataloged and stored like survival rations. 3 months after the accident, Philip announced that we couldn't afford professional help. "The medical bills are astronomical," he said one evening as I sat in what had become my chair, a recliner positioned in the corner where I couldn't accidentally bump into anything valuable. "And with your real estate income gone?" "My real estate business." For 15 years, I'd been one of the most successful agents in our affluent suburb, selling million-dollar homes to discriminating clients who appreciated my eye for quality and attention to detail. I'd loved that work, loved the independence it gave me, the the professional identity that was separate from being Philip's wife. Now that income was gone, and Philip made sure I understood exactly what kind of financial burden I'd become. Maybe I could do something from home, I suggested tentatively. Phone work, administrative tasks, something that doesn't require dash. Ruth, be realistic. Philip's laugh was sharp and dismissive. You can barely manage to make coffee without supervision. How exactly do you think you're going to handle clients and contracts and negotiations? The words stung because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. But mostly they hurt because of the contempt in his voice when he said them, the way he spoke to me like I was a child pretending to adult capabilities. When I mentioned orientation and mobility training, programs designed to help visually impaired people regain independence, Philip dismissed them all as unnecessary expenses. Why do you need strangers teaching you things when I'm here to take care of you? He'd say, making it sound like my desire for independence was somehow insulting to his sacrifice. But his version of care felt more like control with each passing day. He took over our finances completely, claiming it was simpler than trying to explain complex statements to me. When friends called, he often answered and spoke for me, saying I was resting or not feeling well or having a difficult day. Gradually, those calls became less frequent, then stopped altogether. People don't know how to act around you anymore, he explained when I asked about our social isolation. Your condition makes them uncomfortable. They don't know what to say. My world shrank systematically. First to the dimensions of our house, then to just the rooms on the first floor where Philip could monitor me most easily, then finally to the living room and kitchen where I spent my days like a caged bird who'd forgotten how to fly. And late at night, when Philip thought I was safely drugged into unconsciousness, I began to hear things that made my blood run cold. Phone calls he took in his study, his voice low and intimate in a way it hadn't been with me in years. Actual laughter, something I hadn't heard from him since before the accident. And sometimes, very late, the sound of our front door opening and closing with practiced stealth, followed by the garage door, followed by his car pulling quietly out of our driveway. Where were you last night? I asked one morning after a particularly long absence. What do you mean? Philip's voice had that careful quality it took on when he was preparing to lie. I heard you leave. Around midnight. You didn't come back until after 3. A pause that stretched just long enough to confirm my suspicions. You must have been dreaming, Ruth. I was here all night. The medication sometimes causes vivid dreams. But I knew I hadn't been dreaming. In my world of darkness, my other senses had become razor sharp. I could distinguish between different cars in our neighborhood by the sound of their engines. I could identify Philip's footsteps from 3 rooms away. I knew the specific way our garage door squeaked when it opened. I knew he was lying. But what could I do? I was trapped in a body that couldn't see, in a house I couldn't navigate alone, financially dependent on a man who was growing to resent my very existence. So I did what I had to do. I pretended to believe him. I played the role of the grateful, helpless wife who couldn't possibly survive without his care and protection. And I began to listen. Really listen. To the phone calls he thought I couldn't hear. To the whispered conversations that ended abruptly when he sensed I was awake. To the way his voice changed when he spoke to whoever was on the other end of those late-night calls, softer, more tender, more alive than it had been with me in years. She's getting worse, I heard him say one night, his voice carrying clearly from the kitchen where he thought the distance would muffle his words. More dependent every day. Sometimes I wonder if she's even trying to get better, or if she's just giving up. Getting worse. More dependent. Not trying to get better. Giving up. I was learning a hard truth about human nature. People will believe what they need to believe, especially when it justifies their own selfishness. Philip needed to believe that I was helpless, hopeless, a burden he was nobly bearing instead of a victim of an accident he had caused. It was easier for him to see me as weak than to face his own guilt. But lying there in the dark night after night, listening to my husband's betrayals unfold in whispers and lies, I was discovering something Philip couldn't see. I wasn't getting weaker. I was getting stronger. And I was learning patience, the kind of patience that comes from having nothing but time to plan, to observe, to wait for the perfect moment to act. It happened on a Tuesday morning in late spring, almost 3 years after the accident that had stolen my sight and revealed my husband's true nature. I was sitting in my designated spot by the living room window, the place where Philip positioned me each morning like a piece of furniture that needed good lighting. The spring sun warmed my face through the glass, one of the few sensual pleasures left in my carefully constrained world. Then something impossible happened. At first, I thought it was wishful thinking, some cruel trick of a mind desperate for stimulation. But there it was, a faint glow where there had been only darkness for so long. Not vision, exactly, but the suggestion of light, like dawn breaking through storm clouds. I sat perfectly still, afraid that any movement might shatter this fragile miracle. Slowly, carefully, I turned my head toward where I knew the window was. The glow intensified. My heart hammered against my ribs as I raised my trembling hand in front of my face. I couldn't see my fingers, couldn't make out any details, but the light was there, real, actual, undeniable light filtering through the curtains Philip had drawn that morning. Every instinct screamed at me to call out, to share this moment, to celebrate this impossible gift. But something deeper than instinct held me back. Some survival mechanism born of 3 years of careful observation and growing suspicion. Instead, I did nothing. I sat in that chair and let tears of joy stream silently down my face, feeling the light warm my skin like a blessing I didn't deserve, but desperately needed. Over the following weeks, my vision improved in small, precious increments. Shapes began to emerge from the brightness, vague outlines at first, then more defined forms. I could distinguish between light and shadow, could make out the basic architecture of rooms I'd memorized by touch and sound. But I told no one. Not Dr. Martinez during my monthly checkups, where I continued to report no changes in my condition. Not my sister Caroline during our brief, supervised phone calls. And certainly not Philip, because by then, I'd learned to read the true rhythm of my house, the real pattern of my husband's secret life. And what I was discovering made me grateful for every moment of returning sight I could keep hidden. Philip's late-night absences had become a predictable pattern. 3, sometimes 4 nights a week, he would slip out after ensuring I was deeply asleep, returning in the early morning hours with carefully rehearsed explanations ready if I questioned him. "Emergency at the office," he'd say. "You know how demanding the Peterson account can be." Or, "Had to help Jim move some furniture. His back's acting up again." Or, "Couldn't sleep. Went for a drive to clear my head." Always something reasonable, always delivered with just the right amount of casual concern for my well-being. But I'd also begun to recognize the sounds that preceded these departures. The longer-than-usual shower, accompanied by the scent of expensive cologne, not his usual brand, but something sharper, more seductive. The careful way he selected clothes in our darkened bedroom, handling fabric with a deliberation that suggested these weren't emergency departures. These were planned encounters. My enhanced hearing had become so acute that I could distinguish between different sets of footsteps in our house. Philip's heavy stride, familiar after decades of marriage. But sometimes during his supposed absences, I heard other footsteps. Lighter steps. Quicker. Decidedly feminine. The first time it happened, I thought I was losing my mind. I was lying in bed one Thursday afternoon. Philip encouraged long naps, claiming they were good for my recovery, when I heard our front door open. Philip's key in the lock, his familiar voice calling out a casual greeting. But he wasn't supposed to be home for hours. Then I heard the second voice. Soft, musical, young. A woman's laugh that made my blood freeze in my veins. Is she here? The voice asked, and I could hear genuine nervousness underneath the casual question. Upstairs, sleeping, Philip replied, his tone as comfortable as if they were discussing the weather. She naps most afternoons now. The medication keeps her pretty drowsy. Medication. I wasn't taking any medication that would cause drowsiness. But I realized with growing horror that Philip had been putting something in my evening tea, something that ensured I slept heavily enough not to wake during his nocturnal activities. I lay perfectly still, every muscle tense, as their voices moved through my house like invasive species colonizing territory that belonged to me. This is beautiful, the woman said, and I knew without seeing that she was admiring something in our foyer. Probably the antique grandfather clock that had belonged to my grandmother, or the crystal chandelier I'd saved for months to buy as a housewarming gift to myself. Ruth has excellent taste, Philip replied, and I could hear the dismissive note in his voice, as if my aesthetic sense was something he'd had to endure rather than appreciate. Had excellent taste, I should say. Before.
Had.
Past tense. As if losing my sight had somehow erased every other aspect of my personality, every other talent I possessed. They moved through our home for 2 hours, their voices rising and falling like a tide of betrayal. I caught fragments of conversation, discussions of restaurants they'd visited together, trips they'd taken, a whole secret life Philip had constructed while I sat in darkness believing myself to be his primary concern. When they finally prepared to leave, I heard Philip say something that transformed my returning vision from a gift into a weapon. Soon, he said, his voice carrying clearly up the stairs. It won't be much longer now. Then we'll be free to start our real life together. Won't be much longer until what? Free from what, exactly? I had my answer a few days later, when my improving vision allowed me to witness Philip going through our important papers, pulling out documents that he studied with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. Insurance papers. Life insurance policies, to be specific. The pieces of a horrifying puzzle began clicking into place with sickening clarity. Philip's reluctance to get me proper rehabilitation or training. His insistence on controlling every aspect of my daily existence. His careful cultivation of my helplessness and dependency. He wasn't just having an affair.
He was planning for my death.
And positioning himself to benefit from it financially. That night, as I lay beside my husband listening to his peaceful sleep, the sleep of a man whose conscience apparently didn't trouble him, I made a decision that would change everything. My sight was returning slowly, but surely. And I wasn't going to waste this miraculous gift on forgiveness or reconciliation or any of the noble responses that society expected from victimized wives. I was going to use it for justice.
But first, I needed to see everything.
Every lie, every betrayal, every detail of the life Philip thought he was building in secret. I needed to gather evidence, document his crimes, and plan a response that would be as devastating as his intended betrayal. Because I was beginning to understand that my husband wasn't just planning to leave me. He was planning to kill me. And I was going to make sure that when he tried, my vision returned like a slow-motion sunrise, revealing a world I barely recognized as my own. By the 4th year after my accident, I could see well enough to read documents, distinguish faces clearly, and move through our house with complete confidence. But I maintained my performance of blindness with an actress's attention to detail, using my cane, trailing my hand along walls, asking Philip to read things I could now see perfectly. It was on a warm June afternoon when I finally witnessed the complete scope of his betrayal. Philip had left for what he claimed was a crucial Saturday meeting with potential investors, another story in his growing catalog of lies designed to explain his frequent absences. I waited exactly 1 hour after his departure, then positioned myself at the living room window that offered a clear view of our circular driveway. What I saw there shattered the last remnants of my faith in human decency. Philip's silver BMW was pulling into our driveway, but he wasn't alone. A woman emerged from the passenger side. Young, maybe 35, with honey blonde hair that caught the sunlight like spun gold. She wore a sundress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary, and when she smiled at Philip, her entire face transformed with genuine, radiant affection. I recognized that expression. I'd worn it myself once, many years ago, when Philip and I were young and I still believed in the future we were building together. But what devastated me wasn't just seeing her. It was seeing him. Philip looked younger than he had in years, his movements more animated, his smile broader and more genuine than anything I'd witnessed since before the accident. He took her hand as they approached our front door, and the gesture was so natural, so comfortable, so intimate that I knew this wasn't a casual affair. This was love. Real, established, committed love that had been growing and flourishing while I sat in manufactured darkness. I heard them enter through the front door, heard Philip's voice take on that careful, lowered tone he used when he thought I might be listening from my supposed invalid's perch upstairs. "She's resting," he said, his voice carrying the easy dismissal of someone discussing a burdensome pet. "Reading, probably. Or trying to. She spends most of her time with those audiobooks now. It's really quite sad." "Does she suspect anything?" The woman's voice was softer than I'd expected, with a slight southern accent that made her words sound like music. "How could she?" Philip's laugh was sharp and cruel. "She can barely find her way to the bathroom without help. Ruth's completely dependent on me now. Sometimes I think she's actually getting worse instead of better." The casual cruelty of his assessment hit me like a physical blow. 4 years of pretending to be helpless, and Philip had bought my performance so completely that he'd forgotten I was still a human being with feelings and intelligence. "I feel terrible about this sometimes," the woman said, and I was surprised to hear what sounded like genuine guilt in her voice. "Don't," Philip replied firmly. "You didn't cause her accident, Amanda. You didn't choose this situation. We found each other in spite of everything, not because of it." Amanda. Finally, I had a name for my replacement. Found each other. I wondered how long ago that had happened, how much of my married life had been a performance even before the accident that stole my sight. They moved through our house, and I crept carefully to the top of the stairs, positioning myself in the shadows where I could observe without being detected. From this vantage point, I could see into our living room, watch as Philip played host in the home we'd built together over 27 years. Amanda moved through our space with a familiarity that made my stomach clench. She knew where Philip kept the good wine, the bottles we'd been saving for special occasions that apparently now included entertaining his mistress. She knew which chair offered the best view of our garden, knew to avoid the loose floorboard near the piano that creaked under pressure. How many times had she been here? How many afternoons had they spent in my home while I supposedly slept upstairs, drugged into compliance by whatever Philip had been putting in my tea? "When do you think?" Amanda asked as Philip poured her a glass of the Pinot Noir we'd purchased during our anniversary trip to Napa Valley. "Soon," Philip replied, settling beside her on our cream-colored sofa. "Dr. Martinez says Ruth's condition is stable now. No real hope for improvement, but no likelihood of further deterioration either." Stable. No hope for improvement. I wondered what lies Philip had been telling about my medical prognosis, what fictional narrative he'd constructed to justify whatever plan was forming in his mind. "And you're certain about the insurance?" My blood turned to ice water in my veins. $2 million from the policy through her old real estate firm, Philip said, his voice taking on the business-like tone he used when discussing profitable investments. Plus another $800,000 from our joint policy. And, of course, there's the house, the investment accounts, everything else. Everything else. My entire life reduced to a balance sheet. After funeral expenses and settling a few outstanding debts, Philip continued, we'll have more than enough to start fresh somewhere. Maybe that villa in Tuscany you showed me, or the house in the Bahamas. Start fresh. Somewhere exotic and far away, funded by my death benefits. I just want you to be absolutely sure, Amanda said, leaning into Philip's embrace with a trust that would have been touching under different circumstances. Once this happens, there's no going back. I'm sure, Philip said, and the conviction in his voice made my hands shake with suppressed rage. I've been sure for months. Ruth isn't really living anyway. She's just existing. Barely that.
Just existing.
As if 4 years of blindness had somehow stripped away my humanity, made me less deserving of life than a healthy person. I watched in horrified fascination as Philip reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a small brown bottle, the kind used for prescription medications. Dr. Chen says it'll be quick and painless, he said, showing the bottle to Amanda like it was a gift he was proud to present. A heart attack brought on by the stress of her condition. No one will question it. She's been so depressed lately, so dependent on pain medication. Pain medication I wasn't actually taking, though Philip clearly planned to remedy that detail posthumously. The timing has to be perfect, Amanda said, though I could hear uncertainty creeping into her voice. Are you sure no one will suspect anything? Who's going to suspect the devoted husband who's been caring for his disabled wife for 4 years? Philip's smile was cold and calculating. I'll be devastated, of course. Completely grief-stricken by the loss of my beloved Ruth. They spent the next hour planning what sounded like their post-murder vacation, discussions of flights and hotels and romantic destinations that made it clear they'd been living a full, rich life together, while I sat trapped in my prison of manufactured helplessness. When they finally prepared to leave, Philip walked Amanda to her car with the kind of solicitous attention he'd once shown me during our courtship. I watched from the window as he kissed her goodbye, watched the way she smiled up at him with complete trust and adoration. She had no idea she was in love with a man planning to commit murder. That evening, Philip returned home with Chinese takeout and an explanation about his afternoon being consumed by tedious paperwork. He was attentive during dinner, asking about my day, making conversation about the audiobook I was supposedly listening to. But now I could see his performance for what it truly was. The careful concern that masked cold calculation. The gentle touches that felt more like a predator toying with prey. The way he studied me when he thought I wasn't aware, assessing me with the clinical detachment of someone planning a crime. After dinner, he prepared my evening tea with the ritual care of a priest conducting communion. Here you go, sweetheart, he said, placing the mug in my hands with practiced tenderness. Chamomile with honey, just the way you like it. Chamomile with honey. It had been my favorite once, back when I trusted the man who prepared it. Now I understood why I'd been sleeping so heavily, why mornings often brought confusion and disorientation despite my supposed lack of medication. I raised the mug to my lips and pretended to drink, letting the liquid touch my mouth while swallowing nothing. Later, when Philip thought I was unconscious, I would pour the drugged tea down the bathroom sink and rinse away the evidence. Thank you, I murmured, playing the grateful invalid one final time. Philip smiled and settled into his chair with his laptop, ostensibly working on client files. But from my position on the sofa, I could see his screen clearly now. He wasn't working on client files. He was researching untraceable poisons and reading articles about sudden cardiac death in middle-aged women with histories of depression and medication dependence. My husband was Googling how to murder me. As I sat there holding my drugged tea and watching Philip research my death, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 4 years of darkness and helplessness. Pure, crystalline power. For the first time since the accident, I knew something Philip didn't know. I had an advantage he couldn't anticipate, intelligence he'd forgotten I possessed. And I was going to use every second of that advantage to destroy him as thoroughly as he planned to destroy me. The only difference was that when I was finished with Philip Gerard, he would still be alive to experience the full consequences of his betrayal. The morning after witnessing Philip's murder planning session, I began building the case that would destroy him. Philip left for work at his usual time, kissing my forehead with the same tender deception he'd perfected over 4 years of lies. The moment his car disappeared from our driveway, I transformed from helpless victim to methodical investigator. My first destination was Philip's study, a room I'd supposedly been unable to navigate safely since losing my sight. In reality, I'd memorized every inch of it months ago, but now I could see clearly enough to read documents, examine files, and understand exactly what my husband had been planning. What I discovered was more damning than I'd even imagined. Hidden in a locked drawer, the key taped under his desk like some amateur criminal, I found a file folder labeled Future Planning. Inside were detailed calculations of our combined assets, insurance policies, and investment accounts. My life insurance policy from my old real estate firm was highlighted in bright yellow, $2.1 million, with Philip as the sole beneficiary. But that wasn't all. There were also printouts of emails between Philip and someone identified only as AM, Amanda Morrison, I presumed. The correspondence went back over 3 years, documenting the progression of their relationship from casual flirtation to serious planning. Can't wait until we're free to be together properly. One email from 8 months ago read, "The villa in Tuscany would be perfect for our fresh start. Just think, no more pretending, no more hiding. Finally, the life we deserve." The life they deserved, built on my death benefits. Another email, more recent, was even more explicit. "The doctor says the method we discussed will be completely undetectable after 48 hours. Natural causes, stress-induced cardiac event. You've done such a good job documenting her declining mental state." Declining mental state. I realized with growing horror that Philip had been creating a paper trail of my supposed depression and instability, probably through carefully manipulated conversations with Dr. Martinez and forged journal entries. The most damning evidence was a series of communications with someone calling himself Dr. Marcus Chen, though I suspected that wasn't his real name. The emails were written in careful code, discussing experimental treatments and compassionate solutions for end-stage patients, but the underlying message was crystal clear. Philip had hired someone to help him kill me and make it look natural. The plan method was diabolically elegant. A combination of substances that would trigger a massive heart attack, something that wouldn't be unexpected in a woman my age dealing with the prolonged stress of disability and depression. The drugs would be completely metabolized within hours, leaving no trace in my system. And Philip had been carefully building a narrative about my declining mental health and increasing dependence on pain medication that I wasn't actually taking. To any investigator, it would look like I'd finally succumbed to the combined pressures of my condition and possibly an accidental overdose of medications I wasn't supposed to have access to. I photographed everything with my smartphone, another piece of technology Philip assumed I couldn't use effectively, and carefully returned each document to its exact position. Then I moved on to the next phase of my investigation. Using our home computer, Philip thought I only used it for audiobooks and simple email. I began researching Amanda Morrison. What I found painted a picture of a woman who specialized in relationships with wealthy, older men. She'd been married twice before, both times to men significantly older and wealthier than herself. Her first husband, a retired pharmaceutical executive, had died of a heart attack just 18 months after their wedding, leaving her with a substantial inheritance. Her second marriage had ended in divorce when her husband discovered her affair with his business partner, but not before she'd secured a settlement worth nearly $500,000. Amanda Morrison wasn't just Philip's accomplice. She was a professional predator who'd identified my husband as her next mark. The beautiful irony was almost poetic. Philip thought he was manipulating her into helping him commit the perfect crime, while she was manipulating him into providing her with another wealthy husband to eventually dispose of when his usefulness expired. They truly deserved each other. Over the following weeks, I became a woman obsessed. I documented everything with the methodical precision of a prosecutor building a capital case. I followed Philip's movements when he thought I was safely trapped at home, using rideshare services and careful timing to observe his meetings with Amanda and his mysterious Dr. Chen. The supposed doctor turned out to be Marcus Chen, a disgraced former physician who'd lost his license 3 years earlier for writing fraudulent prescriptions and selling controlled substances. He was working out of a shabby office in a strip mall across town, offering alternative medical services to people who couldn't afford to be choosy about their healthcare providers. I recorded conversations using voice memo apps Philip didn't know existed, photographed meetings he thought were secret, and built a comprehensive case file that would have impressed any law enforcement agency. But I wasn't planning to take this to the authorities. Not immediately. First, I wanted Philip to understand exactly what it felt like to be trapped, helpless, and completely dependent on someone who was planning to betray you in the most fundamental way possible. I wanted him to experience the fear I'd been living with for months. And I wanted Amanda to see the true face of the man she'd chosen as her next victim. My plan was ambitious but beautifully simple. I would turn Philip's own strategy against him, using his assumptions about my helplessness to orchestrate his complete and utter destruction. But timing would be everything. One mistake, one moment of carelessness, and I could end up dead instead of victorious. I started by subtly disrupting his routine. When Philip prepared my evening tea, I began occasionally complaining that it tasted bitter or off, forcing him to prepare a fresh cup. This disrupted his careful dosing schedule and gave me opportunities to observe his reactions when his control was challenged. I also began displaying early symptoms of the cardiac issues Philip was planning to artificially induce. Occasional chest pains that sent him into barely concealed panic. Shortness of breath that made him hover anxiously nearby. Complaints about irregular heartbeat that had him suggesting I should see Dr. Martinez more frequently. The beautiful irony was that Philip began to worry I might die before he was ready, before he'd gotten all his financial arrangements in order, before he'd established the perfect alibi, before he'd covered all his tracks. He actually started encouraging me to take better care of myself. Maybe you should cut back on the afternoon naps, he suggested one evening after I'd staged a particularly convincing episode of chest pain. All that sleeping might not be good for your circulation. Do you really think so? I asked, playing the concerned patient perfectly. Well, movement is important for heart health, Philip said, though I could see the calculation behind his concern. But don't overdo it. We don't want you getting hurt. Don't overdo it. The man planning to murder me was worried about my safety. Meanwhile, I was laying careful groundwork for the finale I had planned. I contacted my sister Caroline for the first time in months, re-establishing communication without raising Philip's suspicions. Ruth, it's so good to hear from you. Caroline's voice was thick with emotion when I called her. Philip said you've been having a difficult time lately, that you weren't up for talking to people. Another lie. Philip had been systematically isolating me from my support system, making it easier to control the narrative of my supposed declining mental state. I'm feeling much better lately, I told Caroline, making sure my voice sounded stronger and more optimistic than it had in years. I think I'm finally adjusting to everything. I'd love to see you soon. I also reached out to old friends from my real estate days, claiming that my improved adjustment to blindness was making me more social again. I wanted witnesses to my personality and mental state, people who could testify that I wasn't the depressed, medication-dependent invalid Philip was portraying me as. Additionally, I made some discreet calls to attorneys and financial advisors, asking hypothetical questions about insurance policies, estate planning, and the legal procedures that would come into play after Philip's downfall. Because I wasn't just planning to expose Philip's attempted murder plot. I was planning to take everything from him. His reputation, his freedom, his future with Amanda, and most importantly, his sense of power and control. By the time I was finished with Philip Gerard, he would understand exactly what it felt like to lose everything and be completely dependent on the mercy of someone who had every reason to destroy him. The only difference was that I was going to give him exactly what he deserved, while he had planned to give me death. 3 months into my secret investigation, I decided it was time to test the waters. Philip had just returned from another supposed client dinner, though I knew from my surveillance that he'd actually spent the evening at Amanda's apartment, planning the details of my upcoming murder. He was in an unusually good mood, humming softly as he prepared my nightly tea with extra care. "Philip," I said as he handed me the drugged beverage I had no intention of drinking, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" I turned toward him with the expression of innocent curiosity I'd perfected over 4 years of deception. "What would you do if I could see again?" The question hung in the air like a loaded gun. I watched Philip's face cycle through a series of micro-expressions, surprise, calculation, something that might have been fear, before settling into his practiced mask of loving concern. "What a strange question," he said, but his voice had taken on that careful quality it acquired when he was preparing to lie. "Why would you ask something like that?" "I've been having dreams lately," I said, letting a note of wistful hope creep into my voice. "Dreams where I can see your face again, see our home, see the world. They feel so real sometimes." Philip sat down heavily in his chair, and I could practically hear the wheels turning in his head. "Ruth, sweetheart, you know what Dr. Martinez said. The damage to your optic nerves is permanent. It's not healthy to torture yourself with impossible fantasies." But what if it wasn't impossible? I pressed, watching his reflection in the dark window behind him. What if some miracle occurred, and I could suddenly see everything clearly? A pause that stretched just long enough to confirm every suspicion I'd harbored about my husband's character. "Well," Philip said finally, his voice taking on a strange, almost dreamy quality, "I suppose I'd be happy for you." Of course I would. But Ruth, after 4 years of adjustment, after building a life around your condition, it would be quite an upheaval. An upheaval. The return of my sight would be an upheaval for him. "You'd adjust too, wouldn't you?" I asked with feigned innocence. "We'd figure out together, like we always do." Philip's laugh had a sharp edge that made my skin crawl. "Of course we would. Though I have to say, it might be difficult for you. Seeing how much things have changed, how much you've missed." How much I'd missed. I wondered if he was thinking about Amanda, about all the life he'd been living in secret while I sat in manufactured darkness. "Sometimes I think it might be better this way," Philip continued, warming to his theme. "Simpler. You've adapted so well to your limitations. You have routines, systems that work for you. Vision might actually be overwhelming at this point." Overwhelming. He was actually arguing that blindness was better for me. "Plus," Philip added, settling back in his chair with the satisfied air of someone making an irrefutable point, "you're completely dependent on me now. If you could see again, you might want to change things. Want independence you're not really equipped to handle anymore." There it was. The truth he'd been dancing around for 4 years. Philip didn't want me to recover because my helplessness gave him power, control, and the perfect cover for his secret life. "I suppose you're right," I said, allowing disappointment to color my voice. "It's probably better not to hope for miracles." "Exactly." Philip's relief was palpable. "Much better to focus on accepting reality and making the best of our situation." Our situation. As if my blindness was something that had happened to both of us equally. I smiled and took a pretend sip of my tea. You're so wise, Philip. I don't know what I'd do without you. You'll never have to find out, he said, and something in his tone made my blood run cold. I'll always take care of you, Ruth. Always. The way he said always sounded less like a promise than a threat. That night, after Philip had gone to sleep with the peaceful rest of a man whose conscience never troubled him, I lay awake planning the next phase of my revenge. His reaction to my hypothetical question had confirmed everything I needed to know about his state of mind. Philip wasn't just planning to kill me for the insurance money. He was planning to kill me because my helplessness had become central to his sense of power and control. The idea of me regaining my independence terrified him more than the possibility of getting caught committing murder. He needed me to be weak, dependent, grateful for his care. My strength threatened the very foundation of his identity as the noble husband sacrificing his happiness for his disabled wife. Well, Philip was about to discover just how strong his helpless wife had become, and just how devastating the consequences of underestimating someone could be. Over the next few weeks, I began displaying subtle changes in behavior that I knew would unsettle him. I moved through the house with slightly more confidence, occasionally reaching for things without the careful searching motions he'd grown accustomed to. When he read to me from newspapers or magazines, I sometimes corrected details I couldn't possibly have known through audio alone. "How did you know the article mentioned a red car?" he asked one evening after I'd caught him in a small lie about a news story he was supposedly reading to me. "Lucky guess," I said with an innocent smile. "You always seem to mention red cars when you're making up details." Philip went very still. "Making up details?" "Ruth, I would never." "Oh, I know you wouldn't do it on purpose," I said quickly, as if reassuring him. "But sometimes when you're tired, you elaborate on stories to make them more interesting for me. It's very sweet, actually." I watched him struggle with this explanation, trying to decide whether I was accusing him of lying or complimenting his creativity. The uncertainty was exactly what I wanted, a crack in his confidence, a seed of doubt about how much control he actually had over our situation. I also began asking more questions about our finances, claiming that my improved adjustment to blindness was making me more interested in practical matters. "How are we doing with the medical bills?" I asked one evening as Philip balanced our checkbook at the kitchen table. "Fine," he said tersely. "You don't need to worry about money." "But I'd like to understand our situation better," I pressed. "Maybe there are ways I could help, things I could do from home to bring in some income." Philip's pen stopped moving across the page. "Ruth, we've discussed this. You're not capable of working anymore. Your condition." "My condition affects my sight, not my brain," I said with a firmness that made him look up sharply. "I'm still intelligent, still capable of contributing to our household." For just a moment, I saw something flicker across Philip's face, fear, perhaps, or the beginning recognition that his helpless wife might not be as helpless as he'd assumed. "Let's not discuss this now," he said finally. "You're obviously tired." But I wasn't tired, and we both knew it. What I was becoming was dangerous. Dangerous to his plans, dangerous to his control, dangerous to the comfortable narrative he'd constructed about our life together. And I was just getting started. 6 months had passed since I'd begun my careful campaign to unsettle Philip's confidence, and I could see the strain beginning to show in his behavior. He was drinking more, sleeping less, and watching me with the kind of intensity usually reserved for laboratory specimens. But I was ready for the next phase of my plan. It began on a Tuesday evening in late autumn. Philip had spent the afternoon at what he claimed was a boring insurance seminar, though I knew from tracking his phone that he'd actually been at Amanda's apartment finalizing the details of my murder. He returned home agitated and distracted, barely acknowledging my greeting as he went straight to his study to make several hushed phone calls. When he finally emerged an hour later, I could see the decision written across his face like headlines in a newspaper. Tonight was the night they'd chosen to kill me. "How was your seminar?" I asked as he moved around the kitchen with unusual purpose. "Educational," Philip replied without looking at me. Very enlightening. I watched from my position at the kitchen table as he prepared my evening tea with more care than usual. Instead of his normal routine, a tea bag dunked hastily in hot water, he was measuring precise amounts of loose chamomile, timing the steeping process with his phone, adding honey with the precision of a pharmacist preparing a prescription. You're being very meticulous tonight, I observed. Philip's hand jerked slightly, spilling a drop of honey on the counter. I want it to be perfect for you, he said, his voice tight with nervous energy. You've been having such a difficult time lately. You deserve something special. A difficult time. As if my manufactured depression and supposed declining health were natural developments rather than carefully orchestrated symptoms of his psychological manipulation. When Philip handed me the mug, I noticed his hands were trembling slightly. Here you go, sweetheart. Extra honey, just the way you like it. The tea smelled different tonight, still chamomile and honey, but with an underlying chemical note that made my stomach clench with understanding. This wasn't just the mild sedative he'd been giving me for months. This was something else entirely. Something final. Thank you, I said, raising the mug to my lips and pretending to take a grateful sip. It tastes wonderful. Philip watched me with the intensity of a predator observing wounded prey, his eyes fixed on my mouth as I pretended to drink. I could see the calculation behind his gaze, probably estimating how long the poison would take to work, planning his performance of grief-stricken discovery. Philip, I said, setting the mug down carefully, before I finish this, could you help me with something upstairs? I think I dropped my earrings behind the dresser, and I can't reach them. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. The request was interfering with his carefully planned timeline, and I could see frustration flickering across his features. Can it wait until tomorrow? He asked. You should finish your tea while it's hot. Please, I said, injecting just the right note of helpless pleading into my voice. You know how much those earrings mean to me. They were my mother's. Philip sighed with the exaggerated patience of a man humoring an unreasonable child. Of course. Let me help you upstairs. The moment we left the kitchen, I heard the front door open quietly, Amanda, arriving for her supporting role in my supposed death scene. She would be Philip's alibi, the grieving girlfriend who'd rushed over to comfort him in his hour of loss. But she was about to get a very different kind of performance than the one she was expecting. Upstairs, I played the part of the helpless woman searching for lost jewelry, keeping Philip occupied while the poison tea sat cooling in the kitchen below. After 15 minutes of careful stalling, I finally found the earrings I'd never actually lost. Oh, there they are, I said with manufactured relief. Thank you so much for helping me. I feel so much better now. When we returned to the kitchen, I noticed Amanda's presence immediately, her perfume lingering in the air. The sound of muffled voices from the living room quickly stifled when they heard our footsteps. Philip, I said innocently. Did someone come to the door while we were upstairs? I thought I heard voices. No, Philip said too quickly. Just the television. I left it on in the living room. But there was no sound of television now, just the careful silence of people holding their breath. Well, I said, settling back into my chair and reaching for the poison tea, let me finish this lovely tea you made for me. Philip leaned forward slightly, his entire body tense with anticipation. In the living room, I could sense Amanda waiting, probably positioned where she could witness my collapse and later testify to Philip's apparent shock and grief. I raised the mug to my lips one final time, tilted it as if draining the contents, then set it down empty on the table. Delicious, I said with a contented sigh. I feel so relaxed already. What happened next was a masterpiece of performance art. Over the course of the next 20 minutes, I began displaying the symptoms Philip was expecting to see. A gradual progression from contentment to drowsiness to apparent distress. Complaints about feeling dizzy, about my heart racing, about sudden chest pain that made me clutch at my chest with convincing desperation. "Philip," I gasped, allowing real fear to color my voice, not fear of dying, but fear that my performance might not be convincing enough. "Something's wrong. I can't breathe properly." Philip knelt beside my chair with practiced concern, though I could see the anticipation in his eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart? How do you feel?" "My chest," I whispered, letting my body go limp in the chair. "It feels like an elephant sitting on my chest. And my left arm is tingling." Classic heart attack symptoms, exactly what Philip would expect from the poison he'd given me. "I'm calling 911, Philip announced, though his movements toward the phone were deliberately slow. "No," I gasped, grabbing his wrist with a grip made weak by design. Just hold me. Please. I'm scared." This was the moment Philip had been planning for months, his beloved wife dying in his arms, the perfect culmination of his careful strategy. I could see the satisfaction flickering behind his mask of concern. "It's going to be okay," he murmured, stroking my hair with tender gentleness. "I'm here. I'll always be here. Always. Until death do us part, and maybe not even then if the insurance payout was large enough." I let my breathing become shallow and irregular, let my eyes flutter as if I were losing consciousness. Philip's grip on my hand tightened, and I could sense Amanda creeping closer from the living room, drawn by the drama unfolding exactly as they'd planned. "Ruth." Philip's voice carried just the right note of loving panic. "Ruth, stay with me." I opened my eyes one final time and looked directly at my husband with perfect, crystal-clear vision. "I can see you, Philip," I said in a voice that was suddenly strong and steady. "I can see you perfectly." The words hit him like a physical blow. Philip jerked backward as if I'd struck him, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. "What did you say?" he whispered. I sat up in my chair, my posture straight and strong, my movements smooth and confident. "I said I can see you. All of you. And I've been watching for quite some time now." In the doorway to the living room, Amanda stood frozen like a deer caught in headlights, her face pale with shock and growing understanding. "Hello, Amanda," I said pleasantly, turning to acknowledge her presence. "Thank you for coming tonight. Your timing is perfect." Philip was staring at me as if I'd risen from the dead, which, in a way, I had. You can?" he stammered, unable to complete a coherent sentence.
See?
"Oh yes, Philip. I can see everything. Your secret phone calls, your afternoon visits with Amanda, your research into untraceable poisons, your careful planning of my murder." I smiled with the serene confidence of someone holding all the cards. "I've been watching you dig your own grave for months now." The color drained from Philip's face as the full implications of my words sank in. "You've been able to see this whole time?" "Not the whole time," I said conversationally. "My vision started returning about 2 years ago. But I decided not to mention it because I was so curious to see what you would do when you thought I was helpless." I stood up from my chair and walked calmly to the kitchen sink, where I poured out the contents of a second mug, the one I'd actually been drinking from while Philip watched me consume the poison tea. "Did you really think I'd be stupid enough to drink something you prepared after hearing you plan my murder?" I asked, turning back to face them both. "I switched the mugs while you were distracted upstairs. I've been drinking plain chamomile tea while you've been watching me consume your little chemical cocktail." Philip's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But the symptoms?" "Acting," I said simply. 4 years of being treated like an invalid gave me plenty of practice pretending to be helpless." Amanda found her voice first. "Philip, what is she talking about? What poison? What murder?" I looked at her with something approaching pity. "You really don't know, do you? You thought you were just having an affair with the married man. You had no idea he was planning to kill me for the insurance money. That's not. Philip, tell her that's not true, Amanda said, but I could see doubt creeping into her eyes. Philip said nothing. He couldn't because we all knew it was absolutely true. The poison is probably still in the mug, I continued helpfully. I'm sure the police will find it very interesting when they test it. Along with all the emails between you and Dr. Chen, the research you've been doing on untraceable toxins, and the detailed financial planning you've done around my death benefits. The police? Philip's voice came out as a croak. Oh, yes, I said, checking my watch with theatrical precision. They should be arriving any moment now. I called them about 20 minutes ago, right after I heard Amanda come in the front door. They're very interested in attempted murder cases, especially ones with such thorough documentation. As if summoned by my words, the sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, growing steadily louder. Philip sank into a chair, his face gray with shock and dawning realization. You planned this. All of it. Every single detail, I confirmed. Just like you planned my murder. The only difference is that my plan actually worked. The sirens were much closer now, close enough that red and blue lights were beginning to flash through our windows. Ruth, Philip said desperately, we can work this out. We can. We can what? Asked with genuine curiosity. Pretend that you weren't planning to kill me? Pretend that you haven't been poisoning my tea for months? Pretend that you haven't been stealing my life while planning to end it. The police cars pulled into our driveway, their lights painting our kitchen in alternating shades of red and blue. Through the window, I could see officers approaching our front door. There's just one more thing I want you to know, Philip, I said as the doorbell rang with the authority of law enforcement. The tea you've been drugging for months? I never drank a drop of it. I've been pouring it down the bathroom sink every night for the past 2 years. Philip stared at me with the hollow-eyed expression of a man whose entire world had just collapsed. Which means, I continued as the police knocked insistently on our front door, I've been completely awake and aware for every phone call, every secret meeting, every moment of planning my murder. The knocking grew more insistent. I heard everything, Philip. I saw everything. And I documented everything. As I walked toward the front door to let the police in, I turned back to look at my husband one final time. You wanted to know what would happen if I could see again? I asked. Now you know. The next few hours passed in a blur of police interviews, evidence collection, and the satisfying sight of Philip being led away in handcuffs. Detective Sarah Martinez, no relation to my doctor, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who seemed genuinely impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation. Mrs. Gerard, she said as we sat in my living room while crime scene technicians processed my kitchen, in 20 years of police work, I've never seen a victim gather this much evidence against their would-be killer. I handed her another file folder, one of several I'd prepared for this moment. I had 4 years to prepare, detective. And excellent motivation. The evidence was overwhelming. Audio recordings of Philip and Amanda discussing my murder. Photographs of his meetings with Marcus Chen. Copies of emails detailing the plan method and timeline. Financial documents showing the insurance policies that would have funded their new life together. But perhaps most damning of all was the physical evidence from that evening, the poison tea that Philip had prepared, still sitting in its mug with enough toxic residue to kill several people. The lab will need to analyze this, Detective Martinez said, carefully bagging the evidence, but based on the smell alone, I'd say we're looking at a combination of digitalis and potassium chloride. Both readily available if you know where to look, both nearly impossible to detect after a few hours in the bloodstream. Philip always was thorough in his research, I said dryly. Amanda had been arrested as an accessory, though her lawyer was already claiming she'd had no knowledge of the murder plot. I almost felt sorry for her. She thought she was seducing a wealthy husband away from his disabled wife, only to discover she'd fallen in love with a man planning premeditated murder. What will happen to them? I asked as Detective Martinez prepared to leave. Your husband is looking at attempted first-degree murder, conspiracy, and a handful of other charges, she said. With the evidence you've provided, I'd expect him to plead guilty rather than face trial. He's probably looking at 25 to life. 25 to life. Philip would be in his 80s before he had any chance of freedom, assuming he lived that long in prison. And Amanda? Harder to say. If she cooperates and testifies against her husband, she might get a reduced sentence for accessory charges. If she doesn't, Detective Martinez shrugged. The emails suggest she knew more than she's admitting. After the police left, I sat alone in my house for the first time in years without having to pretend to be blind, helpless, or grateful for care I didn't want. The silence was extraordinary. For 4 years, I'd lived every moment under Philip's surveillance, performing disability like a role in a play I hadn't auditioned for. Now, finally, I could simply exist as myself, a woman who could see, who could think, who could plan and execute complex strategies without anyone questioning my capabilities. I made myself a cup of tea, real tea, prepared exactly the way I liked it, with no hidden chemicals or ulterior motives. As I sat drinking in my kitchen, I reflected on the strange journey that had brought me to this moment. Philip had thought my blindness made me vulnerable. Instead, it had made me invisible in a way that allowed me to see him more clearly than I'd ever seen anyone in my life. He'd thought my dependence gave him power over me. Instead, it had taught me to rely on my own intelligence and determination in ways I'd never had to before. He'd thought my isolation made me weak. Instead, it had given me time and motivation to plan the most successful revenge in the history of bad marriages. My phone rang, startling me from my contemplation. Caroline's number appeared on the screen. Ruth. I just saw the news. Are you okay? Do you need me to come out there? Word was already spreading. By tomorrow, the local newspapers would be running headlines about the blind woman who caught her husband planning her murder. By next week, I'd probably be fielding calls from television producers wanting to turn my story into a made-for-TV movie. I'm fine, Caroline, I said, and realized it was the first time I'd said those words in years and actually meant them. I'm better than fine. I'm free. But how long have you been able to see? Why didn't you tell anyone? Because I needed to know the truth, I said simply. And sometimes the only way to see people clearly is when they think you can't see them at all. Over the next several days, as the story spread through our community like wildfire, I watched Philip's carefully constructed reputation crumble in real time. The partners at his law firm released a statement expressing shock and disappointment, announcing that Philip had been immediately terminated and that they were cooperating fully with the investigation. Clients began requesting new representation. The country club revoked his membership. But perhaps most satisfying of all was watching the community's perception of me transform overnight. For 4 years, I'd been poor Ruth Gerard, the tragic blind woman whose devoted husband sacrificed so much to care for her. People had spoken about me in hushed, pitying tones, as if blindness had somehow diminished my intelligence along with my sight. Now, suddenly, I was Ruth Gerard, the mastermind, the woman who'd spent years gathering evidence against her would-be killer, while he thought she was helpless. The transformation was dizzying and, I had to admit, deeply satisfying. Friends who hadn't called in months suddenly wanted to have lunch. Neighbors who'd avoided eye contact when Philip was around now stopped by with casseroles and admiration. My former colleagues from the real estate industry reached out to congratulate me on what one called the most impressive long-term strategy I've ever witnessed. But the most important call came 3 days after Philip's arrest. Mrs. Gerard? This is Rebecca Thompson from Thompson, Walsh and Associates. We're a victims' rights law firm, and we'd like to discuss representing you in civil proceedings against your husband. Civil proceedings. I hadn't even thought about that aspect of the situation. What kind of proceedings? I asked. Well, given the circumstances, you have grounds for several types of civil suits. Intentional infliction of emotional distress, assault, battery, attempted murder, fraud. Rebecca's voice took on the excited tone of a lawyer who'd spotted a particularly promising case. And then there's the matter of the insurance policies and assets he was planning to steal. Assets he was planning to steal. I realized with growing excitement that Philip's arrest had probably frozen all our joint accounts and assets pending investigation. What would that mean, practically speaking? I asked. It means that instead of Philip inheriting your assets when you died, you get to claim his assets as compensation for his crimes against you, Rebecca explained. His law practice, his retirement accounts, his share of your house, everything. Plus punitive damages for the years of psychological torture he put you through. Psychological torture. It was the first time anyone had used those words to describe what Philip had done to me, but they fit perfectly. How much are we talking about? I asked. Conservatively, between his assets and the damages we can prove, probably somewhere in the range of $8 to $12 million, Rebecca said. And that's before we factor in the insurance fraud charges and the attempted murder. $8 to $12 million. More money than I'd ever imagined having. All of it taken from the man who'd tried to steal my life. When can we start? I asked. The legal proceedings moved with surprising speed. Philip's attorney, a public defender, since his own assets had been frozen, advised him to cooperate fully in hopes of avoiding the death penalty for attempted murder. Within 2 weeks, Philip had signed over virtually everything he owned as part of a plea agreement that would spare him from facing capital charges. His law practice, his retirement accounts, his car, even his expensive watch collection, all of it became mine. Amanda, meanwhile, had agreed to testify against Philip in exchange for a reduced sentence. She would serve 3 years in minimum security prison for accessory to attempted murder, followed by 5 years of probation. But the most satisfying moment came when I received the final financial settlement documents. Philip Gerard, the man who'd planned to kill me for my insurance money, was now completely destitute. He would spend the next 25 years in a maximum security prison with no money in his commissary account, no assets to his name, and no hope of ever rebuilding the life he'd thrown away. Meanwhile, I was worth nearly $10 million and finally, truly free for the first time in decades. 6 months after Philip's sentencing, I stood in the courtroom for the final hearing in our civil case. He looked smaller than I remembered. Prison had a way of shrinking people, stripping away the confidence and authority that had once made him seem larger than life. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit that hung loose on his diminished frame. His hair, once perfectly styled, was now gray and unkempt. But it was his eyes that showed the real transformation. Where once there had been calculation and cold intelligence, now there was only defeat and the hollow look of a man who'd lost everything that had ever mattered to him. Mr. Gerard, Judge Harrison said, her voice carrying the weight of final judgment, this court finds you liable for intentional infliction of emotional distress, attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. You are hereby ordered to pay damages in the amount of $12.3 million to your victim, Mrs. Ruth Gerard. $12.3 million. The number hung in the air like a benediction. Philip didn't react to the judgment. He'd known it was coming for months. But when his eyes met mine across the courtroom, I saw something that almost looked like recognition. Not remorse, exactly, but perhaps an understanding of how completely he'd underestimated the woman he'd tried to destroy. Additionally, Judge Harrison continued, This court is recommending that the district attorney pursue additional charges related to the systematic poisoning and psychological torture of Mrs. Gerard over a period of 4 years. Systematic poisoning and psychological torture. The words felt like vindication after years of gaslighting and manipulation. When the hearing ended, I walked out of that courthouse, knowing that Philip would spend the rest of his life paying for what he'd tried to do to me. Not just in prison time, but in the complete destruction of everything he'd ever worked to build. His law practice had been dissolved, his professional reputation destroyed beyond repair. His former colleagues wouldn't even mention his name in professional circles. His country club membership was revoked, his social standing obliterated. And Amanda? She'd discovered the hard way that loving a man who could plan his wife's murder came with consequences. Her 3-year prison sentence was just the beginning. She'd lost her apartment, her car, her savings, and any hope of finding another wealthy man willing to support her lifestyle. The other women in prison, I'd heard, didn't take kindly to someone who'd helped plan the murder of another woman. But perhaps the most poetic justice was this. Philip had planned to start a new life in Tuscany with my insurance money. Instead, I was the one planning a trip to Italy funded by his assets, in a villa I was considering purchasing with the settlement money. 2 years after Philip's arrest, I stood on the terrace of a beautiful villa overlooking the Tuscan countryside. The view was spectacular, rolling hills covered in vineyards, ancient olive groves, and medieval towns perched on distant hilltops. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and for the first time in years, I felt genuinely at peace. The villa was mine now, purchased with a small fraction of the settlement money Philip's crimes had provided. It was everything he and Amanda had dreamed of, except they were experiencing it from prison cells while I was living it in freedom. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister Caroline, who was visiting from Phoenix. The wine tasting at the vineyard this afternoon is at 3 p.m. Can't wait to celebrate your new life properly. My new life. At 61, I was discovering what it meant to live entirely for myself for the first time since my 20s. The money from Philip's assets had given me choices I'd never imagined having. I'd bought this villa in Tuscany, a penthouse apartment overlooking the ocean in California, and a charming cottage in the English countryside. I was living like a woman who'd won the lottery, which in a way, I supposed I had. But more importantly than the financial freedom was the psychological liberation. For the first time in decades, I made decisions based on my own desires rather than someone else's needs or expectations. I ate what I wanted, traveled where I pleased, and surrounded myself with people who valued my intelligence and independence. The story of my revenge had made international news, inspiring articles about domestic abuse, financial manipulation, and the dangers of underestimating victims. I'd been interviewed by major magazines, featured in documentaries, and invited to speak at conferences about victims' rights. But I'd turned down most of the attention. After years of having my life controlled by someone else's agenda, I was protective of my privacy and autonomy. My phone rang, a video call from my former real estate colleague, Maria Santos. "Ruth, how's Italy treating you?" Maria's face appeared on my screen, beaming with genuine happiness for my new circumstances. "Like a queen," I said, adjusting the camera so she could see the vineyard vista behind me. "I'm thinking of buying a small winery. Can you imagine me as a vintner? After what you did to Philip, I think you could be anything you set your mind to," Maria laughed. "Speaking of which, have you seen the news about Amanda?" I hadn't been following Amanda's post-prison life very closely, but I was curious. "What about her?" "She got out last month and tried to write a book about her experience. I fell in love with a killer or something like that. But no publisher would touch it, and she's apparently working at a grocery store in Ohio now, using her maiden name." Amanda Morrison, who'd once dreamed of luxury vacations funded by my death, was now bagging groceries in Ohio. The irony was almost too perfect. "And Philip?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Still in maximum security. His lawyer tried to appeal the sentence last year, but it was denied. He'll be eligible for parole when he's 82, assuming he lives that long." 82 years old. Philip would be an elderly man before he had any chance of freedom, spending his remaining vital years locked away while I lived the life he'd tried to steal from me. After ending the call with Maria, I walked through my villa, admiring the artwork I'd chosen, the furniture I'd selected, the books I'd collected. Every single item was there because I wanted it, not because someone else had chosen it for me or told me it was appropriate for a woman in my position. The freedom was intoxicating. That evening, I sat on my terrace with a glass of wine from my own vineyard. I'd decided to buy it after all, and reflected on the strange journey that had brought me here. Philip had thought my blindness made me vulnerable, when actually it had made me more perceptive than I'd ever been before. He'd thought my dependence gave him power over me, when really it had taught me to be more self-reliant than I'd ever imagined possible. Most importantly, he'd thought my love for him meant I would always forgive him, always trust him, always put his needs before my own well-being. He'd been wrong about everything. As the sun set over the Tuscan hills, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold, I raised my wine glass in a silent toast. To justice, to freedom, to the power of patience and the sweet taste of revenge served at exactly the right temperature. And to the truth I'd learned through 4 years of darkness. Sometimes you have to lose your sight to finally see clearly. My name is Ruth Girard, and this was my story of how 10 years of blindness taught me to see the world and the people in it more clearly than ever before. The darkness had ended, but my real life was just beginning. I'm writing this from my study in the California penthouse, watching the sunset paint the Pacific Ocean in shades of gold and amber that remind me of that first morning in Tuscany when I realized I was truly free. It's been 5 years since Philip's arrest, 3 years since I started this new chapter of my life. The legal proceedings are finally complete, the media attention has died down, and I've settled into a routine that brings me genuine happiness for the first time in decades. Yesterday, I received a letter from Amanda. She's working as a clerk in a law office now. Apparently her experience with the legal system during her trial sparked an interest in criminal justice. She's enrolled in night school, studying to become a paralegal. The letter was an apology, genuine this time, not the calculated manipulation of our previous interactions. Prison had apparently given her time to reflect on the choices that had led her to fall in love with a man planning murder. "I know I can never undo the pain I helped cause you," she wrote. "But I want you to know that I think about you often, and I'm grateful that you survived Philip's plan. You deserved so much better than what we put you through." I wrote back, a brief note wishing her well in her studies and her new life. Forgiveness, I've learned, isn't about absolving others of their crimes. It's about freeing yourself from the weight of resentment. Philip, meanwhile, remains in maximum security prison. I don't correspond with him, don't follow news about his appeals or his health. He's become irrelevant to my life in a way that would have seemed impossible during those dark years when his opinions shaped everything I did. The most satisfying update came from Detective Martinez last month. She called to tell me that my case had been used as a training example for law enforcement officers dealing with domestic abuse situations. "Your documentation was so thorough, your strategy so careful," she said. "We're teaching other officers to recognize the signs of long-term psychological manipulation and to take victims seriously when they report seemingly impossible situations." My story was helping other women. That knowledge meant more to me than all the money I'd won from Philip's assets. This morning, I had coffee with my neighbor, Mrs. Elena Rossi, a widow in her 70s who'd become one of my closest friends here in California. She's teaching me Italian in exchange for English conversation practice, and we spend hours discussing books, travel, and the adventures available to women who've learned to live for themselves. You know what I love most about your story? Elena said as we watched surfers riding waves below my balcony. It's not just that you got revenge on your husband. It's that you got something better than revenge. What's that? I asked. You got your life back. You got to become who you were always meant to be. She was right. The money, the properties, the public vindication, all of that was satisfying. But the real victory was simpler and more profound. I'd reclaimed my autonomy, my voice, my right to exist on my own terms. At 64, I'm living with more purpose and joy than I had at 30. I travel when I want to, eat what pleases me, surround myself with people who appreciate my intelligence and independence. I've taken up painting, learned to cook properly, and even started dating again, carefully, slowly, with the wisdom that comes from surviving betrayal. The villa in Tuscany produces wine that's starting to win regional awards. The cottage in England hosts writing retreats for women over 50 who want to explore creative pursuits they'd postponed for decades. The penthouse in California is my home base, the place where I write and think and plan the adventures that fill my calendar. But perhaps most importantly, I've learned to trust my own judgment again. The woman who was gaslit into believing she was helpless and dependent has been replaced by someone who knows her own worth and refuses to settle for less than she deserves. Tomorrow, I'm flying to New Zealand for a photography expedition. Next month, I'm joining a group tour of Morocco. In the spring, I'm planning to take a cooking class in Lyon and visit the art museums of Florence. All of these adventures are funded by the money Philip thought he would inherit when he killed me. The irony never gets old. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the years I spent in manufactured blindness, if I wish I'd exposed Philip's deception earlier and spared myself the psychological trauma. The answer is no. Those 4 years of darkness taught me things about myself I never would have learned otherwise. They showed me that I was stronger, smarter, and more resilient than I'd ever imagined. They proved that I could survive betrayal, plan complex strategies, and execute perfect revenge when the situation demanded it. Most importantly, they taught me that sometimes the greatest gift is not seeing what you expect to see, but learning to perceive what's really there. My name is Ruth Girard. I lost my sight for 10 years, but when I got it back, I saw my husband planning my murder. Instead of becoming his victim, I became his judge, jury, and executioner, not of his life, but of the life he'd tried to steal from me. And now, finally, I'm living the life I was always meant to live. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt invisible in your own life or underestimated by people who should know better, then you understand Ruth's journey. Hit that subscribe button and ring that notification bell. Every Tuesday, we share stories of women who refuse to stay victims, who turn their pain into power and their betrayal into triumph. Drop a comment below. What would you have done in Ruth's situation? Would you have exposed Philip immediately, or would you have waited and planned like Ruth did? And if you have your own story of justice and revenge, we want to hear it. Your story could be featured in a future episode. Remember, you're stronger than you know, smarter than they think, and more capable than anyone who's tried to diminish you could ever imagine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction, it's transformation. Until next Tuesday, keep fighting, keep rising, and never let anyone convince you that you're less than extraordinary. This is Her True Stories, where women's voices matter and justice always finds a way.